Welcome to the keynote session for Track 2, Diversity and Inclusion in India. In this track, we are examining how companies can take the lead in tackling inequality and creating inclusive workplaces in India. As we design our conferences, we seek to bring you fresh insights and perspectives, presenting a lineup of speakers and experts that will inspire and empower you to drive your strategy forward. That's why we are absolutely delighted to introduce this next session with guest speaker Pooja Sachdev. In this keynote session, business psychologist and consultant Pooja Sachdev explores key themes from her book Rewire, a radical approach to tackling diversity and difference. This highly acclaimed book takes a fresh look at the issue of equality, diversity, and inclusion at work. It critiques the current thinking and practices that are responsible for slow progress in this area. It also provides readers with a new holistic and tactical perspective that leverages what we know about influencing and changing people's mindsets. By way of background, Pooja has worked with a wide range of organizations from local community groups to large multinational corporations. She specializes in unconscious bias, gender at work, culture, engagement, and well-being. She's a qualified counselor, coach, and group facilitator committed to the ethos of bringing out the best in others and enabling individuals and organizations to fulfill their potential. We've invited Pooja to make a 25-minute presentation to all of you. She'll also be available for an online Q&A session after this. Over to you, Pooja.
Thank you very much, Rashmi. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to be part of this important event here today. I hope you're all enjoying it. My name is Pooja, and I have been working in this area of diversity and inclusion in some shape or form for the last 20 years. But my passion for this started at a very young age. I was 15 years old in my 10th standard in school in Mumbai. And unfortunately, like a lot of my peers at the time, I was forced to, at that very young age, witness the Hindu-Muslim riots that took place in our city, in my hometown. So from that age, from 14, 15 years old, I became obsessed with trying to understand how we define ourselves and our groups, who we are and who we are not, where those group identities come from, and how they become so powerful in our minds that they drive us to do things that may seem irrational at best, but inhuman at times. Now, that was 1993, and now it's almost 25 years later, and I'm still asking, and many college degrees later, I'm still asking the same question, because it remains as relevant as ever. The world is getting smaller, and we can no longer hide in our little bubbles, in our little towns and our little communities and our little safe circles. We are forced to confront differences. We are forced to grapple with the different ways in which we define ourselves, who is us and who is them. And so when I talk about diversity in this context, I'm not just talking about the big strands. I'm not just talking about race, gender, LGBT. Of course, it is all those things, but it's also all the other ways in which we are different. So when I say diversity, I also mean caste. I also mean young and old. I also mean Gen X, Gen Y. I mean urban and rural, India and the West. It's about how we define who is us and who is them. And then how we live and work together with those differences. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach for the next 20 or so minutes. I don't want to talk about the usual stuff in diversity and inclusion, the usual stuff being policies, rules, quotas, metrics. All that is the work of diversity that is going on, and it's important and it is being done. But what I want to take is a slightly wider view today. I want to take a perspective that treats diversity as a wider issue, as a human issue. So let me start by saying, this is the picture of what we see in organizations today. So I have spoken to a lot of companies where I've asked them sort of, you work in diversity, or what is the work you do in diversity? When you say diversity and inclusion, what are the activities or the initiatives? And this is the sort of range of things we see. You often hear, almost always, companies have an equal ops policy somewhere on the website. There's often training going on of different kinds, whether it's old school, kind of showing a video and talking about diversity, sort of diversity training, or unconscious bias awareness raising. There's quite a bit of leadership development around diversity and inclusion now. Sometimes it's targeted to particular groups, of women's development, for example. And there are affinity or network groups that are doing a lot of good work in organizations. So as you can see, there's a wide range of activity and some very good activity taking place. Definitely a lot of time and effort and money being spent. And yet, when I ask people, so is it working? Is it making a difference? The response is always lukewarm. Yeah, we think so. Yeah, sort of. And when we talk about success in this area, we're often talking about very small percentage shifts. So the percentage of women moved from 15% to 16% to 17% in this particular area in the last year, for example. And while every small shift should be celebrated and it is a mark of success, at the same time, it does raise the question of why progress in this area is so slow. Even though we see change, it's not at the same pace as you might see change in other areas, for example, technology. And sometimes it feels like we are still having those same old conversations. We may have changed the jargon, but we are still having the same conversations that we were having 10 or 20 years ago. So what's stopping progress? And we ask people that, and this is what we hear. So people say, yes, of course, we have a flex working policy, or now we have paternity leave as well, or we have the rules in place. We are monitoring X, Y, and Z. But when it comes down to it, my manager doesn't really believe I'm working if I'm not in the office. They just don't believe it. They just don't think like that. Or when the senior most manager, when he or she is in the office on that day, we all have to be there because they don't really believe in this whole work from home thing. Or you hear things like, yes, they say that. I understand that's the policy that's on the website. They want to hire more women. But then if you look around, you look at the profile of senior leaders, it's all male. So not really sure how that works. Or you hear comments along the lines of, that's just the nature of this industry. That's just what it's like in engineering. Or that's just what it's like in marketing. Or that's just what it is. That's just how it's always been. You can't really change the mindset at the top. That's just how they think. So what these comments are all pointing to is something systemic in the mindset of people that we need to address. And that's my kind of big point that I would like to get across here today, is that it's not enough. It is important, but it's not enough to focus just on policy and process and metrics. There's no point, for example, putting in a flex working policy if the mindset of managers doesn't support it. So you've got to look at all those things, but you've also got to look wider at culture. So when I say culture, I'm talking about both organizational culture and social culture and the ways in which they interact in different countries. So in order to see sustainable change in diversity and inclusion, we've got to make it a broad and positive case for changing culture. We can't have diversity and inclusion that's just about grievance or reparation or fixing inequality, and definitely not just about legislation or compliance. We have to be intentional about culture. This is something that affects all of us. We all are different in some way or the other. Diversity affects every single person, even if you don't fall into any of the major strands. And we've got to be specific about what we want to do with culture, about wanting to create a positive and inclusive culture. So I put up here one of the definitions of organizational culture, one of the most widely cited definitions by Shine. And I do this because whenever I talk about culture, people always say, how do you define it? And as an occupational psychologist, me and my peers will often talk about culture by using analogies. So you might say, well, to understand your culture, let's see what kind of animal is your organization. What are the characteristics, or what kind of car, for example? And the reason we use these analogies is because a lot of what culture is about is intangible. And it's hard to kind of put your finger on it and put a definition on it. So when I say culture here, I'm taking the widest possible definition. So looking at this model from Shine, it's about these three levels, where the top of the iceberg there is artifacts and behavior. And what that includes is visible stuff. So the dress code, the office layout, the materials, the things you see around you. The second level there, the espoused values, are kind of what the organization says they believe in. So the mission statement, maybe the values that are on the website, slogans, what you hear through the marketing, what we say we are about. And the bottom layer there is the basic underlying assumptions. That's the bit that's not always visible, not tangible, but probably the most important in driving how the organization functions. So those are the unwritten rules, the ways of behaving, the things that are in the mindset that are taken for granted, that drive what we value, what we reward, who we promote, and how. Who makes decisions? Where is the power? How do decisions get made, and how do things get done? Really, how do things get done? Not what the rules are. So when I talk about culture, I mean paying attention to all these three levels of culture, taking the widest view possible, and paying particular attention to where there's a disconnect between two levels. So for example, where there's a disconnect between the espoused values and what the real basic assumptions are. So here's an analogy from the manufacturing and construction sector. Organizations often say we have a safety culture. It's a phrase that's touted a lot. And what it means here is that safety is paramount. It means that there are strong and well understood messages about ways of behaving that keep people safe from harm, that keep employees and customers and everybody free of harm. Maintaining a low accident rate is important. And this kind of safety culture is part of everything, from the overall vision down to kind of day-to-day activity. So for example, meetings will always start with a safety briefing, and the role of a fire warden is taken very seriously. And anyone at any level can speak up if they see some kind of a threat to safety. So if you're passing by an area, even if it's not your department, and even if you're the junior most person in the room, if you see a spill or some cables that are not stored properly, you will speak up, because safety is paramount and it trumps everything else. So imagine if a culture of inclusion worked in the same way, where the principle of inclusion was part of everything we did, and anyone and everyone had the responsibility and the autonomy and the power to point out a more inclusive way of doing things, or point out where things were not as inclusive as they could be. So much easier to say, pay attention to culture and change culture, than actually do it. And here I've put up the model that we have presented in the book, which is a 6-phase model. Now, this is not at all to say that in 6 easy steps you'll change your culture, because we know that it's definitely not easy. And it's definitely not simple. And this is not the only model of culture change that's out there, but it's one of them. And the principle behind this model is not to say this is set in stone and you have to use these 6 processes, but it's a starting point. It's a framework that's attempting to address all the different facets. So the idea is that you have to take a holistic view, not just focus on 1 or 2 dimensions of culture change. So not, for example, just focus on metrics and processes, but you've got to also look at leadership, behavior, governance, and look at all these things, not just in any random way, but in a very strategic order. So try to understand how these together will drive the organization towards the same desired outcome, how they will work in alignment with each other, and also how will all these activities align themselves with the overall strategy and the overall purpose of the organization. So what are we trying to achieve as an organization? And how does our diversity strategy align with that? And then how does activity in all these areas align with that goal? So it's about taking a holistic and a strategic view and paying attention to all the different facets. So now I'm not going to talk about all of these because we don't have time, and some of them are kind of more obvious than others. But I am going to talk about one of them, and that's the second box there, imagination. And the reason I choose to talk about that one is because it's the one that jumps out at people. People often say, what's that doing on there? It doesn't kind of immediately make sense. And it's also the one where we probably have the most potential for impact. But before I get on to that, a quick exercise. So say I say the word leader to you, or if I say great leader. If you don't think too hard, what pictures jump into your mind? Who do you imagine? What's your picture of what a great leader looks like? Well, if you ask Google Images, these are the kind of the pictures that come up on page 1. So you can sort of see there's a bit of a pattern here, and there's obviously clearly some leaders missing from this picture. What about if I say CEO? What jumps into your mind? How do you picture your typical CEO? Or what does a CEO look like if you had to just kind of say to a child or say to an alien? This is what Google Images says. So again, you can see that there's a bit of a pattern here in terms of what your typical CEO or what your typical leader looks like. Even though we know that CEOs come in all different shapes and sizes and colors and genders, yet this is what our typical CEO looks like for most people. We know that not all CEOs wear black suits. They don't all cross their arms like this. And yet we have an image. Now, this is not news that we have archetypes or we have stereotypes. But I guess my point here is that knowing that we have stereotypes that lead to assumptions, that lead to generalizations, and leads to biased thinking, how do we then get behind what our stereotypes are, what our assumptions are? And how do we work around them and still make good quality and fair decisions at work? And this is where imagination comes in. So Einstein said imagination is everything, and that's absolutely true. Throughout our lives, from early childhood, we are bombarded with messages about how things are, how things should be, what is good, what is normal, what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a boy. And this is a picture taken not very long ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, from a toy store in Mumbai. Very strong messages. And these messages are what shape our ideas about what is realistic and what's possible. And the only way to then tackle these ingrained ideas is by changing what we look at. So change the imagery, change the story, change the narrative. At an unconscious level, our brain makes links between what we see or what we are capable of imagining and what ultimately becomes possible in real life. So I had a conversation a few years ago with a colleague who works in the FMCG sector in India, and she was saying we are struggling to get talented women. So I said, why is that? And she said, because the banks, they're snapping up business school graduates. And I said, that's interesting that the women are choosing to go and work in financial services, because we are used to in the UK and in the US talking about how financial services is a very male-dominated industry, and yet in India, the most talented females are being snapped up by banks. Why is that? And she said, well, it's known that one of the few industries in which women can really progress is banking. As you know, if you think about who's at the top of the chain, the country head of HSBC India, the CEO of ICICI at that time was a woman. And so women see this as a place that they, as an industry in which they can progress. So what that shows is that very, very few very senior, high-profile appointments like that can change the entire mindset of people and can draw women in. And that's the power of kind of role models. That's the power of what you see, of what you can imagine. So a lot of this is common sense, but psychologists are, paying a lot of attention now and putting a lot of work into trying to understand exactly how imagery, imagination can change unconscious bias. So for example, these pictures here are from a very interesting study that was done a few years ago in University of Barcelona. where people were asked to enter this kind of immersive virtual reality setting, and they had a kind of head-mounted display and a body tracking device, and they had the experience for a few minutes of embodying an avatar on the screen. So, and that avatar could be either light-skinned, dark-skinned, or purple-skinned. And they measured bias. So they used the Harvard IAT to measure implicit attitudes of people before and after they were in this immersive virtual reality setting. And they found that the people who embodied a dark-skinned avatar had reduced bias against dark-skinned people if they took the test soon after doing this. And this is only for a few minutes. And that's not the only one. There's a lot of work where people are shown images of, for example, positive images of Black people. So they look at pictures of Michael Jordan and Martin Luther King, and then they take the race IAT, and they find that they have a reduced bias against Black people. And it works the same with elderly people. So, you know, when people are looking at images of Mother Teresa or Albert Einstein, and they take the age IAT just after that, they have a reduced bias against elderly people. And that's just by looking at some pictures, some positive pictures. But my favorite study of all, which I have to always mention because it doesn't even use pictures, is one that was done by Turner and Crisp going back a few years now, where they asked people to close their eyes for 2 minutes, just 2 minutes. And they said, visualize having a positive interaction with a Muslim stranger. And they also tried it with an elderly stranger. And they found that the people who had this 2-minute visualization of having a positive interaction, having a good conversation, talking about their lives and leaving feeling happy, when they compared it to other people who closed their eyes, for example, for 2 minutes and just visualized the scenery or something neutral, they found that these people who had this positive visualization had a reduced bias against the groups. So against Muslims or against elderly people. And that's just 2 minutes of close your eyes and imagine if. So the point here is that it's not even real life experiences. This is just the power of our imagination. And the reason it's so exciting is because it tells us that those biases and those stereotypes that are so ingrained in us from early childhood and from bombardment from the media from all these years that we feel are so hard to shift, they can be shifted. They can be changed. And this gives us hope, and it's the closest we've come to any kind of silver bullet in this area of diversity and inclusion. So now what does that mean? What do we have to do? What do you and I have to do with this knowledge? What do we have to do with this information? Well, the idea is that we have to become much more acutely aware of our communication, of the words we use, the images we use, and it's about everything from small to big. So it's about everyday conversations. It's about what we say in emails, what words we use to describe each other, especially in settings like in performance appraisals. What words do we use and what do they mean? What weight do we give those words? How do we describe each other? Right up to the big things. So we're talking about big tactical poster campaigns. And the idea is to look at the whole wide range of communications and get people thinking and talking in a way that changes the narrative, that changes our assumptions, and that develops a new and inclusive mindset. So when I talk about the small things, let me give you an example. I was riding in the train. I was going for a day trip with my daughter, who's 4 years old, and she loves trains. And we sat down in our seat, and I was very excited. We took out our snacks and everything, and we're sitting there. And so where we normally ride in buses, you know, where you can see the driver right there. And so we sat down in this train, sat down in the bus, and she said to me, "Mommy, where's the driver?" So I thought, oh, she must be worried because she can't see the driver. I said, no, don't worry about the driver. He's all the way in front because he has to see where we're going. And she said, "Mommy, how do you know it's a man driver?" And I thought, isn't that amazing? Because this is the work I do. I talk about this all day. And yet I said, why did I make that assumption? And what a powerful impact it would have had if I had said she at that moment. So that's the small stuff. And here's an example of the big stuff. This is a campaign we ran at HSBC a few years ago. I don't need to explain these too much because the posters are self-explanatory. And it's an example of how words and pictures can be used to challenge stereotypes. So here we are, culture change, and we're back to this 6-phase model. And there's more on each of these other aspects in the book, a lot more detail and a lot more examples, which I don't have the time to go into here today. But one thing I would like to leave you with is 3 questions. And the reason I do this is because when I present this work, often people say to me, this is all great, but where do I start? What do I do first? This is too much. What do I do? And so here's where you start. Appreciative inquiry. Question 1, what would it look like if your organization was truly inclusive? So by that I mean, what behaviors would you see? What would be different from today? What would you hear people saying? How do you imagine that? What does success look like in this context for you and for your organization? The second question is a bit of action planning. So right now we know where we want to go. How will we get there? What steps do we need to take? What actions are needed? Where do we need to focus? And what's going to stand in the way of doing that? And how will we overcome those obstacles? And the third question, probably the most important, is what can I personally do? So everybody, each one of us has power to affect change, whether it's in a big way or a small way. And where do you have power to make a difference? And what can you commit to doing differently when you go back to work? And finally, I want to end with the why. Why should we do this? Why should you do this? Why should organizations do this at all? Why should they care about this? And these pictures up here are there to symbolize how power has shifted in society over the years, from palaces to corporations. Whether public, private, or charity, large or small, all organizations affect society at some level, whether it's a local, community level, or at a global level. Organizations hold more power than ever before to shape how we think and how we act as a society. Some of you may have noticed I had a picture of on an earlier slide from the Ariel Share the Load campaign. That's an example of an organization trying to make a difference in society, trying to speak up for a value that they believe in, and making an impact. Organizations can set higher standards. We can set rules for our employees. We work across national borders. And we have the responsibility to move this agenda forward, not just within ourselves, not just for our organizations, not just because there is a commercial business case, but because we have an impact on the societies and the communities in which we operate. So this is a quote from Obama's speech going back to January 2016. It's quite old, but I think it's still relevant. I'll give you 1 minute just to read it. And although he's referring to America, I think this is very relevant to organizations. Even as organizations, we need to be clear about who we are, what we stand for, and what we can achieve together, not just in terms of commercial success, but in terms of our impact on the world that we all live in. So that's it from me. Thank you all very much for taking the time to listen. I hope you found it interesting, and I'd be very happy to take any questions or carry on the conversation later via email or other means. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Pooja, for that presentation. What I found particularly fascinating and interesting for India was your comment that in order to achieve sustainable positive change, we need to focus on how to create a culture of openness, empathy, and inclusion. And this is so important because this drives innovation and corporate strategy wonderfully. I've read Rewire and I found it a very good combination of some of our classic HR frameworks that all of us really like. And it has got some everyday examples as well. So, audience, if you would like to order a copy of Pooja's book, we are delighted to offer a special 10% discount to registered attendees of this conference. You can simply log on to the Bloomsbury website and use the promo code Rewire, or you could even buy it from Amazon. We are now going to open it up for questions. If you have a question, please use the online chat function. I'm just going to look at the chat, and I see that there is a question from Sandhya. And Sandhya is asking, more often than not, religion, politics, or any such sensitive topics are avoided in work environment. Is this a challenge to achieving truly inclusive mindset?
Hi, Sandhya. Thank you for the question. I think you're absolutely right. And this is one of the barriers that we face in organizations, which is kind of stigmas that exist in society as a whole kind of creep in to organizational speak and organizational culture. So if it's taboo in the outside world, it's likely to be taboo in the organization. And this is where organizations have an opportunity to kind of take the lead on being brave in these areas. To take the lead and saying, actually, we will tackle these issues head on because we are an independent body. We have values. We know who we stand, what we stand for, and what we believe. And we have the means and mechanisms. So organizations have power in the sense that they can kind of impose rules on employees. They can create ways of working that might be not so typical in the culture. So there's actually an opportunity there to kind of take the reins and say, you know what, we're not going to not talk about these issues. It's important to us. It's part of who we are. It's what we believe. So we're going to tackle it head on. And it's about being brave in this context.
Thank you, Pooja. We have another question from Kate, and she wants to know a little more about your book, and she wants to know why you wrote it and how it has been received so far.
Okay, thank you. So the book is really a passion project. I wrote it because, to be honest, for many years I resisted working in the area of diversity and inclusion because I didn't want to be that short Indian female again harping on about, that typical picture of your D&I person in a company here. And I kind of said, I just don't want to do that work. I just want to do other work and be in the kind of mainstream. But over the years of doing other work and being kind of broadly in consultancy and broadly in research, I started seeing how D&I was being handled. And I just couldn't help putting my toe in the water. And I guess a book was born mostly out of frustration with how this topic is being dealt with in a kind of a narrow way. And I knew that it could be done a lot better. So, this book is about kind of saying, over all these years of looking at how organizations have done diversity, this is where I think the problem lies. So that was the kind of the impetus, not a very positive impetus, but it was kind of what drove us to write it. So I think that's where the book has come from, and it's doing well in the sense that we're getting good reviews. We had a very good write-up in the FT and other publications. So yeah, it's getting a good response, and we're getting a lot of questions. I'm getting a lot of inquiries about it as well. So it's obviously it's making an impact.
I'm sure it is doing the rounds and making a lot of impact to people who really value diversity and inclusion. I have another question here, and this is more in terms of what you would recommend companies do to address their unwritten rules.
Yeah, this issue of unwritten rules is probably the most challenging when it comes to organizational culture, because that's the bit that people are not always aware of it. Those are the blind spots in organization. And it's kind of similar, I guess, to when you do personal therapy. It's what you don't know about yourself that can be the most powerful in impacting how you behave, but also the most difficult to change. So I suppose the very first step there is to find out what they are. What are those unwritten rules and ways of working that are driving the organization? So forget about the policies and what's on the website, but how do people really get stuff done? Like, how are decisions being made? So get under the surface. And that's part of the kind of the stage one in my 6-phase model is about diagnosis. So it's about diagnosing the organization and getting at that under the surface level. So it's about knowing yourself. It's about understanding, uncovering what they are. And once you know what they are, then you can kind of start evaluating what role they play. So kind of, this is a norm, this is a normative behavior in our organization, this is what kind of tends to be in the mindset of most people or most managers. And then you ask questions like, where has this come from? Where has this belief come from? Is it still relevant? Is it helpful? What purpose does it serve? And the most important is, what impact does it have on inclusion? It might be a harmless belief, or it might be impacting inclusion. And if it does impact inclusion in a negative way, then the question is, how, where do we want to be? You choose what you need to change and how you need to change it.
Thank you. And actually, it drives me to the last question that I had. And it ties in very, very well with the diagnosis that you were just speaking about as well. Because we see that employees are often introduced to conversations around sensitive topics in the workplace, like gender, LGBT, etc. So, how can a progressive organizational culture be taken out of its microcosm and then affect change in the wider society?
Yeah, I mean, this is the most, I guess this is the kind of the big point that I was trying to bring across. And the first thing to say there is that all organizations are part of and they touch society. So it's not just, sometimes I speak to private sector and they kind of think it's not their job. Because we are private sector, we are a for-profit organization, but it's not just charities or public sector that have an impact on society. It's every single organization, because whether it's through your customers, the people who use your product or service, or at the very least, it's your employees. Like, you do touch the lives of your employees and their families. So all organizations have an impact on communities and on society. So kind of nobody is kind of living in a bubble. Nobody's exempt from this. And I mean, of course, there are examples of big things, like big actions. So, I love this Ariel Share the Load campaign, because what they've done is they've used their advertising medium to send a message about what is basically social inequality, but about division of labor, gender division of labor in society, and what an impact that has on people's lives. And it's kind of sending a strong social message at the same time as kind of advertising their products. So I feel like that sort of thing is very powerful. There's, of course, many examples of companies that operate in a community, creating work for that community, changing the norms in those communities. For example, if you generate a lot of work for female employees in a particular community, you impact those employees and their families, and you change the kind of the social structure. But again, I want to reiterate that it's not just those big things. It's actually it's little things. It's about just how we do business, kind of how we define our beliefs, our values, and how we kind of then do business in a way that's aligned with that. It's taking a stand on issues that are outside of your immediate remit. So, if like American companies taking a stand about not doing business in states where and there's no anti-discrimination legislation for LGBT. So it's kind of taking a stand on issues like that. And I think in this day and age, everybody kind of expects companies to be clear about what their beliefs are. It's, you can't kind of hide away from these things anymore. So it's about setting precedents. It's about kind of, making, just doing business in a way that's aligned with those values. And I suppose the main thing for me here is taking a long-term view. One of the things that brings companies down is just taking a view, taking a short-term view about kind of next quarter profits rather than thinking about the long term.
Thank you, Pooja. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for you today. Thank you so much for taking your time out and being with us. And thank you to the audience as well. You've been fantastic with a lot of questions coming in. The session will be available for download for the next 30 days. So we encourage all of you to log in, view the session, and also share it with your peers. Thank you so much, and have a great day and enjoy the conference.
My pleasure.